You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Spectator's political editor, Katy Balls, and the broadcaster and commentator, Andreou. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Metro leads with the government taking its own COVID inquiry to court over the disclosure of Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages. The Guardian says people who lost loved ones to the pandemic have condemned the move. The Financial Times points out that Mr Johnson has, in fact, only handed over messages from May 2021 onwards, when he acquired a new phone. It's also the top story for The Eye. The COVID inquiry also covers the front of The Times, this time with the headline, "Battle over Johnson Messages." And ministers go to war with judge over COVID WhatsApps, reads the front of the Daily Mirror, as they too lead with the same story. The Sun speaks directly to Philip Schofield, who denies he groomed the young colleague with whom he had an affair while working on This Morning. The Daily Mirror also leads with an exclusive from a presenter on This Morning. This time, however, it's from Holly with the headline, "I've nothing to hide." And the front of the Star looks at how the cost of living has affected our fish and chip shops. There you are. Reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Katy Balls and Andreou. Welcome to you both. Let's start with The Sun and this exclusive interview that they have with Philip Schofield, the first time that he's spoken out, aside from his messages and tweets, etc., on social media. Katy, take us into this.
Yes, so as you say, exclusive interview comes after Philip Schofield, of course, stepped down, pushed out, and ultimately runs with the headline, "I'm broken and ashamed, but not a groomer." And Philip Schofield is using this interview, I think, to fight back, you could say, from some of the press coverage, some of the claims by some of his former colleagues, some anonymous, in recent days, to try and set the record straight. He is acknowledging, as he has in written statements, that he did have a relationship with a younger male colleague, but he is saying that this does not count as grooming. And he is also saying that he regrets it, but this is an isolated mistake, and he doesn't recognise some of the things that are being said about him. Now, of course, there's lots of accounts right now. I think the question is how seriously or how much people trust what Philip Schofield says at this point, and what implications does it have in terms of the rolling consequence of this, in terms of not just Philip Schofield, the man who was involved with Philip Schofield, but also the future of the breakfast show, because there are some saying, how can it really go on? Are management going to have to go? Who knew what when? And I think this is where the story is now going.
Yes, the paper reporting that Philip Schofield has been in hiding since what they describe as the scandal broke, Alex. But now, as Katy says, really the story potentially turning to the duty of care that ITV had towards the male colleague involved.
Yes, and on one side, you have the sort of human drama of it all, and it's hard not to be shocked at the distance and speed and depth of the fall from grace. On the other hand, you have a multi-million-pound company that is a public company that has a share price and shareholders, and that employs thousands and thousands of people being directly affected by this, because its breakfast programming is its sort of mainstay. And so you have those two things playing off against each other. And yes, I agree with Katy. I think this is Schofield's attempt to begin to fight back a little bit, to begin and put his own narrative out there. I mean, who knows what has happened between two people behind closed doors? But what is becoming increasingly difficult to believe is that no one around them knew anything, and that they managed to mislead everyone from their closest friends and colleagues to their managers. And so I think that is what ITV, in its own part, is trying to manage.
Yes, and we're starting to hear from other people involved. Holly Willoughby in one of the other papers saying that she's nothing to hide. Also, that the Mail has spoken to Philip Schofield's wife, and she reportedly is furious, Katy.
Well, you would expect her to be furious, really, if the reports are correct that she didn't know about this. Her husband led her to believe that there was nothing untoward. This man was a friend and a colleague, nothing more than that. There's also a detail in, I think, in that report saying that his daughter only found out really moments before this became a public story. So while we're obviously talking about the corporate consequences, there's clearly, a family being torn apart potentially by the story, by what Philip Schofield is admitting to. And I think that it's interesting in terms of the Holly Willoughby, you have sources close to her saying she has nothing to hide. In this interview, and we've so far seen snippets of it from the front page and from the write-ups, he also seems to be apologising to his co-host for, which seems to corroborate Holly Willoughby's account, which was that she asked her colleague about this and she was told nothing was happening. And of course, that plays into will she return to the sofa? Because there have been some figures saying, actually, surely she must have known something she shouldn't. And I think this probably is adding to the argument that she is in a place to do that unless something else comes forward.
Alex, let's move on to another story. This in The Guardian, the first one we can take a look at and how they're covering it. And this is the ministers launching an attempt not to hand over WhatsApp messages to the COVID inquiry, Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages.
I mean, this is extraordinary. There's no other way to describe it. This is, in summary, the government taking an inquiry that it set up and gave powers to court because it's saying it's overstepping those powers that it gave it. And so it's an extraordinary struggle, even on the basics of it. But then the politics come into it, and that make it 10 times more scintillating, because what you have is, for many, many days, the Number 10 and Cabinet Office were briefing that it was really, they were trying to protect Boris Johnson, until Boris Johnson basically lobbed a grenade at that yesterday by coming out and saying, I'm perfectly happy for everything to be published. In fact, I will give it to the inquiry directly if you don't. And that really set the cat amongst the pigeons. So the Cabinet Office then had only two options: to either comply with the deadline or to go to court and seek judicial review. And there is a supreme irony to what they're doing, in that they're invoking the Human Rights Act, which up until really a couple of months ago, it was this government's policy to repeal that act. And not only are they invoking that act, they're invoking powers that flow from Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the one they constantly say is causing them huge amounts of trouble when lefty lawyers are using it to obstruct what the state wants to do. And there they are now. They have found their own lefty lawyers, and they're taking effectively another expression of the state that they created to court in order to avoid handing over this stuff. I mean, it is simply extraordinary.
And Katy, the criticism levelled often is that, if you've nothing to hide, why don't you want these messages really put in the public domain?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many angles to this story and what's happening at the moment. Of course, yes, if you've got nothing to hide, publish them. The fact that Boris Johnson's saying something different from the government, I don't think he's perhaps being so helpful. Though curiously, he's saying he's happy to give these messages to the inquiry. He's yet to do so. And some of his messages aren't available, but I think we'll come on to that later. But yes, is it because they have something to hide, or is there precedent? I think that this is all right now about Boris Johnson, but of course the problem for the government is if they allow these messages unredacted, so the messages unfilled to go to the inquiry, and they may have to do that if the judicial review is not successful, it sets a precedent for serving ministers, including the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to do the same. So I think you can start to see a world where there's going to be lots of messages, and they would argue that these are not specifically related to the COVID inquiry, so why put them out there? But I think you could enter a scenario where ultimately this current saga creates a precedent by which every serving minister who had a role in the pandemic is having to hand over all the messages to this inquiry. And it is quite a strange thing in the way that the government is now almost suing its own inquiry seems to be where we've got to so early on in the entire process. Often these inquiries can be called whitewashers, too soft. I don't think this seems to be a problem with how the COVID inquiry is shaping up. I think it looks like it's really going to, hold the feet of the government to the fire.
The eye pointing to the fact, Alex, that Boris Johnson hasn't handed over his own messages covering the first year of COVID-19, and he claims that security services told him not to turn on his old personal mobile phone because it contains WhatsApps from before May 2021. And that's after the number became available online. So it's because of security.
Yes, I remember that story from the time, actually, in the furthest reaches of my memory. So much has happened since. Of course, Johnson is now offering to make those messages available, provided basically the right tech support come to turn on his phone to make sure that it's not a security threat. But there's the really interesting angle of this, and Katy referred to it there in her summary, is that the government is treating this as if they're giving this stuff over for publication. They're not. They're handing this stuff to a senior judge that they appointed. And she will be the judge of whether to publish it or not. So if there's something in there that is completely private and entirely irrelevant, I think it's extraordinary to express the notion that they can't trust the very senior judge that they appointed to not publish that. And so the whole thing is being fought as if handing this stuff over will mean its immediate publication in all the papers, and that's just not the case. They're handing it over to the judge whose primary duty is to look over all this stuff and judge what is in the public interest and what is relevant and what is not. And I think she's quite right to claim that they can't make that determination for her. They can't pre-decide what is relevant and just pass that stuff along. And I see the prospects of success for the government in the judicial review as very, very low.
Yes, and Katy, the FT pointing to the Cabinet Office, their argument is that the request for unambiguously irrelevant material goes beyond the powers of the inquiry, and they're not wanting a precedent to be set in this respect.
Yes, and of course, I think that point is completely correct, which is this stuff isn't, these messages wouldn't be immediately made public. But clearly there's a concern in government, the precedent of handing them over even to a judge, an independent inquiry, and then putting them out there when they think they're just so clearly irrelevant. Now, one of the arguments is it could show that the focus in government was not where it needed to be, because these messages show where other things were. But then you also wonder, a lack of attendance of Boris Johnson at various COBRA meetings, which is one of the questions that we believe the judge who is in charge of the inquiry, Judge Hallett, is asking about, also point to that as is. So I do think it's tricky in the sense. I think right now, without knowing what exactly the messages are on all these things, to know how relevant or how much of an intrusion these things are. But it does feel as though lots of legal experts tonight are saying that they do not think the government has a very good chance in the judicial review. So we may end up in a scenario where ultimately they have to do so anyway.